Marcus Carter stepped into the luxury shopping center, his worn jeans and simple black t-shirt contrasting sharply with the gleaming glass walls and polished marble floors around him. The air in the room hummed with the quiet luxury of designer stores and high-end boutiques. Nobody paid him much attention at first until security did. Jeffrey Collins, head of security for the center, watched Marcus's calm approach with suspicion. With his arms crossed, Jeffrey stepped forward, blocking Marcus's path. "Excuse me, sir, I think you're in the wrong area," he said, his voice sharp, as if trying to put Marcus in his place. Marcus raised an eyebrow, glancing down at his casual outfit, the kind that didn't scream wealth, but still, something about the way Jeffrey sized him up felt off. "I'm just trying to enjoy the shopping center," Marcus replied evenly, his voice low and composed. Jeffrey didn't budge. "I'm going to need to see some ID. You don't look like you belong here." The words stung, but Marcus didn't let them show. He slid his wallet from his back pocket, handing over his ID without a word. Jeffrey glanced at the ID, then tossed it back with a sneer. "This isn't the kind of place for people like you," he muttered, his tone dripping with condescension. The words hit Marcus like a slap, but he remained composed. He wasn't about to let this man define him. Marcus knew how this went. He'd been dismissed, overlooked, and discriminated against his whole life. But this time, it wasn't just a casual slight. It was happening in the very place he owned. His hand tightened around the edges of his wallet. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady, but with an edge that hinted at what was to come. Jeffrey shook his head, dismissing him. "You need to leave. Now." As the tension in the air thickened, Marcus noticed a few shoppers nearby, glancing nervously. It wasn't just him. People were starting to notice. But Marcus wasn't about to make a scene. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant, Mia. "Mia, it's happening. Prepare the protocol," he said, his voice calm, barely a whisper in the chaos of his thoughts. The seconds felt like minutes. A few. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One man, standing near the espresso bar, took a hesitant step forward, his phone in hand. He was recording the interaction, not out of malice, but because he knew something wasn't right. "Hey, what's going on?" he asked. "Why is he being treated like this?" Marcus didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The quiet anger building within him was enough to fill the room. As Jeffrey barked at him to leave once again, Marcus stood taller, his posture firming like a steel rod. "You really think I don't belong here?" he said, each word dripping with a quiet power that was felt more than heard. The room went still. All eyes were now on him. "Then ask yourself, why do you?" The crowd shifted, tension turning into something more, curiosity, then support. Without missing a beat, Marcus pulled out his phone again and activated a special protocol he had set in motion years ago for moments like this. Within minutes, Jeffrey's confidence began to waver. The truth was coming. The truth was always the most powerful thing in a room. And Marcus had it in spades. Marcus stood in the middle of the luxury shopping center, his feet planted firmly on the polished marble floor. His eyes never left Jeffrey, the security head who had just crossed a line. The silence in the air was deafening. People were watching, the tension so thick that it felt like the whole room was holding its breath. Jeffrey seemed to sense it too, the shift in the atmosphere, but he refused to back down. "You're making a scene," he muttered under his breath, trying to maintain control, but his voice cracked. Marcus didn't respond right away. He simply took a deep breath, his calm demeanor more unsettling than any outburst. He wasn't here to argue, not with someone like Jeffrey, not in a place that should have known better. Instead, he pulled out his phone again, dialing his assistant, Mia, for the second time. "Mia, I need you to activate protocol now," Marcus said, his voice steady, yet every word dripped with the weight of authority. A few seconds passed, and Marcus didn't flinch. He watched as the crowd around him began to stir, the whispers growing louder. Some of the onlookers began recording the scene. The fact that a black man was being harassed in a luxury space like this was not something they were willing to let slide. The tension was palpable, the kind of moment that begged for action, and Marcus was ready to give them exactly that. "Sir, I told you to leave. Jeffrey's voice was getting more strained, his confidence slipping. But Marcus was already steps ahead. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice still calm, but with an edge that could cut through steel. "I own this shopping center, Jeffrey. This is my place." The words hit Jeffrey like a punch to the gut. He froze for a second, his mind scrambling to process the revelation. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Marcus didn't give him the chance to recover. "You called me a fraud in the very place I built," Marcus continued, stepping closer, his voice unwavering. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The crowd around them shifted, some of the bystanders putting down their phones as the reality of the situation sank in. They had witnessed something no one should ever experience: the arrogance of privilege, the weight of racial discrimination in its most blatant form. But now, they were witnessing something else: the calm, composed response of a man who wasn't going to let it slide. "I've been through worse," Marcus said quietly, but his words carried the gravity of years spent overcoming adversity. "You think this is about a ticket or a seat or a shopping center. This is about respect. This is about standing up to people like you." Jeffrey's face turned pale, the color draining from his cheeks as he realized that Marcus was no ordinary customer. He was the owner, the one who could change everything with the push of a button. And as if on cue, the tension that had been hanging in the air snapped. Marcus lifted his phone again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. "Mia," he said calmly, "send the report to corporate. Let them know what's happening here." His assistant's voice crackled through the line, crisp and professional as always. "Already done, sir," Mia replied, her tone sharp. "We've logged everything. The board is on alert. They're monitoring in real time." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He could feel the power shift in the room. This wasn't just a moment of confrontation, it was the beginning of something bigger. As Jeffrey stood there, speechless, the crowd began to murmur in disbelief. It wasn't just about Marcus now, it was about what he represented. A system that had long been broken, a culture of exclusion and bias that had finally met its match. And Marcus wasn't done yet. "You've been humiliated today," Marcus said, looking directly at Jeffrey. "But the truth is, you've been doing this for years. And it ends now." The moment felt like it lasted an eternity, but in truth, it had only been minutes. The crowd around Marcus started to gather their things, exchanging glances and nods of approval. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses to a new kind of justice being served. As Marcus turned to leave, he paused for a second, locking eyes with Jeffrey once more. "Remember this moment," he said quietly. "You'll be the one explaining this." The message was clear. Marcus had just turned the tables. And Jeffrey, for all his bravado, was left standing in the ruins of his own arrogance. The atmosphere in the shopping center had shifted completely. What had started as a quiet confrontation between Marcus and Jeffrey had now turned into a public spectacle. People were still murmuring, some watching from a distance, while others were recording. Jeffrey, who moments ago had been so confident in his authority, now stood there, frozen, realizing the gravity of the situation. He had underestimated Marcus, and the consequences were now unfolding. Marcus stood tall, his calm demeanor making him seem even more powerful. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, but he didn't need their approval. This wasn't about them. It was about righting a wrong that had been allowed to go unchecked for far too long. As Marcus turned to walk away, a soft voice interrupted him. It was Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had spoken up earlier. She had been standing quietly on the sidelines, but now, she stepped forward, her face full of conviction. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, but full of gratitude. "I've seen this happen so many times, and I didn't think someone would stand up to them." Marcus nodded at her, acknowledging her words, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His actions had spoken louder than any words could. As he continued walking toward the exit, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and more people began to notice what had happened. Whispers of admiration spread, some even applauding softly as Marcus made his way out. By the time he reached the doors, the entire shopping center felt different. The weight of his actions had shifted the dynamics in a way that couldn't be undone. The people who had witnessed the event understood something had changed, something had been set in motion. And it wasn't just about a man being harassed in a shopping center. It was about breaking down the systems of prejudice that allowed these actions to continue unchecked. Outside, Marcus took a deep breath. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of pride in what he had done. Not because of the spectacle, but because he had acted with dignity. He had shown the world what true power looked like: quiet, controlled, but unyielding. As he stepped into his car, he pulled out his phone and called Mia again. "Get the report ready," he said. "I want everything documented. We're not letting this go." Mia's voice came through immediately. "Already on it, sir. The board is reviewing the situation. We've got it all covered." Marcus smiled, the weight on his shoulders easing just slightly. It wasn't the end, but it was a start. And that, in itself, was enough. As the car pulled away, Marcus glanced back at the shopping center, his mind already working on the next steps. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it head-on. As the car cruised through the city, Marcus let his thoughts wander, his mind still processing the events that had unfolded earlier. The incident at the shopping center was just one moment, but it felt like the culmination of so much more. It wasn't about Jeffrey or even the shopping center. It was about the systems that allowed this kind of discrimination to happen time and time again. He knew this was just the beginning. In the days that followed, Marcus's name started circulating more widely. The news of what had happened spread, but not just in the way he expected. It wasn't the sensationalized story that the media often spun. It wasn't about a viral moment for the sake of views. It was about the shift in perspective that had taken place. People were starting to understand what it meant to challenge the status quo, to stand up in the face of systemic bias and say, "Enough." Marcus had been doing this his entire life, in one way or another, fighting against the assumptions people made because of the color of his skin, proving that he belonged in spaces that had never been meant for him. But this was different. This time, the world was watching. And as the days turned into a week, the calls started to come in. Some from people who had been there at the shopping center, others from individuals who had heard the story and wanted to know more. They were all asking the same thing. What's next? What Marcus had done that day was more than just standing up for himself. It was a demonstration of something that was long overdue, the power of quiet resistance. He wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. He was simply unapologetic. That was what people responded to. It wasn't about fighting back in the traditional sense. It was about standing firm, knowing your worth, and demanding respect without needing to shout for it. It was something people hadn't seen much of, but something they could recognize when they saw it. It was real power, the kind that didn't need to be explained, just shown. As Marcus sat at his desk that afternoon, he looked out the window of his office. The skyline stretched before him, a testament to his hard work, his vision. But it was also a reminder of how far he had come, and how far there still was to go. He had the power to change things, to challenge the systems that had held so many people like him down for so long. But he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed because of their race. As he looked down at his phone, the notification from his assistant, Mia, flashed on the screen. It was an update on the situation at the shopping center, and it was clear things were changing. The people who had witnessed the incident were starting to speak up too. They were sharing their stories, talking about what they had seen, and that was starting to make a difference. People were beginning to ask questions they hadn't thought to ask before. And that, Marcus realized, was the real victory. It wasn't about what had happened in those few moments at the shopping center. It was about what would happen after. The ripple effect had begun. And Marcus, for the first time in a long time, felt a sense of hope. He wasn't just waiting for change anymore, he was helping to make it happen. Days passed, and the ripple effect that Marcus had sparked continued to grow. The media, which had initially been quick to dismiss the incident as just another unusual encounter, began to take notice of the underlying message. This wasn't just about one black man standing up for himself in a shopping center. It was about something bigger, something systemic. The public was starting to ask the right questions. pushing for answers that had long been ignored. Marcus had set the stage for change, and now, it seemed like the world was ready to listen. At his office, Marcus sat at his desk, reviewing the latest reports. His phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the screen. It was Mia, his assistant, with an update on the aftermath of the shopping center incident. "The public response is overwhelming," Mia said on the other end of the line. "People are really starting to take action. Social media is buzzing with support, and some of the witnesses are even starting to organize a movement around it." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment sinking in. This was more than just a fleeting moment of personal triumph. This was the start of something much larger, a movement that had the potential to reshape how people of color were treated in high-end spaces and in society at large. As Marcus processed the information, he thought back to the way Jeffrey had looked at him, the sneer in his voice when he had dismissed Marcus as someone who didn't belong. But now, Marcus realized that the real power didn't come from standing up to people like Jeffrey. It came from changing the system that made people like Jeffrey feel entitled to act that way in the first place. The phone rang again, this time from a private number. Marcus didn't hesitate to answer. "Marcus, this is Carla," the voice on the other end said. Carla Evans was one of Marcus's closest advisors, a sharp and strategic mind who had been with him through some of his biggest challenges. "I just wanted to let you know that we've already started putting things in motion. The board's on board with a major overhaul of our internal policies, and we're going to take this opportunity to make a statement, publicly and legally." Marcus's heart raced with excitement. This was exactly what he had been hoping for, the opportunity to leverage his position to push for real, systemic change. "I want this to be more than just a statement," Marcus said, his voice calm but determined. "I want to see the policies change across the board. This isn't just about our company. It's about setting a precedent for the entire industry. If we can make this change here, maybe others will follow." Carla was silent for a moment, processing his words. Then she spoke again. "I think you're right. This is bigger than us, and it's time we make sure the world knows it." Marcus ended the call and stood up from his desk, looking out the window at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the skyline. He had come a long way to get to this point, but now, the horizon seemed clearer than ever before. This wasn't just about fighting back against the system, it was about changing the system, and that required not only courage but strategy. He could feel the momentum building, the collective will to make things right. Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. It was time to take the next step, to move forward with a plan that would not only protect people like him, but also empower them to demand the respect they deserved. And as he thought about all the people who had stood by him, the ones who had witnessed the moment and felt inspired by it, Marcus knew that the change he sought was not just possible, it was inevitable. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Marcus. Every morning, he woke up to a flood of messages, emails, and phone calls. His social media feeds were filled with posts from people who had been inspired by his actions. Some were sharing their own experiences with discrimination, while others were expressing their gratitude for his example of quiet strength. It was overwhelming, but it was also proof that what had happened in the shopping center had struck a chord. People were paying attention, and more importantly, they were ready for change. Marcus knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than one man standing up for himself. It was about a movement, a shift in how people of color were treated in spaces that had historically excluded them. But Marcus was no longer the only one leading this charge. The board of his company had already begun drafting new policies to address discrimination and bias within their own organization. It wasn't just about making a statement. It was about creating lasting, systemic change. As the company's internal reforms began to take shape, Marcus was also focused on a larger goal: to influence the industry as a whole. He had already started speaking with other CEOs, leaders in the business world, about the need for more diversity, equity, and inclusion in high-end spaces. It wasn't going to be easy, but Marcus had always known that change never came without resistance. He was prepared for the challenge. One afternoon, as Marcus sat in his office reviewing the final drafts of the new company policies, Mia entered with a stack of reports in hand. She had a look of determination on her face. "Marcus, you're going to want to see this," she said as she placed the papers on his desk. The media is starting to pick up on the policy changes. It's becoming a story, one that's bigger than just us. Marcus glanced at the reports, his interest piqued. He had been so focused on the internal changes that he hadn't realized how much the public had latched on to the idea of corporate accountability. "What are they saying?" he asked. Mia pulled up an article on her phone and handed it to him. It was from a major news outlet, and the headline read, "Business leaders step up to address discrimination. Marcus Carter's impact goes beyond one moment." Marcus read through the article quickly. It detailed not only the events at the shopping center, but also the steps Marcus's company was taking to set an example for others in the industry. The article was filled with quotes from industry experts, as well as testimonials from employees and customers who praised the changes. Marcus's heart swelled with pride. This wasn't just about correcting one wrong, it was about setting a new standard. As he looked up from the article, Mia smiled. "This is just the beginning," she said. "People are noticing. And the conversation is shifting." Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of fulfillment wash over him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for a future where no one would have to endure the kind of discrimination he had faced. And with every step forward, he was creating that future, one change at a time. As the weeks passed, Marcus continued to speak at conferences, hold meetings with other business leaders, and push for more change in the industry. The momentum was building, and the movement he had started was growing. More companies began to adopt similar policies, and more people started to speak out against the systemic biases that had kept them down for so long. Marcus knew the journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. The power of one moment had sparked a revolution, and Marcus was determined to see it through. As he walked out of his office that evening, the city lights twinkling in the distance, he knew that his fight was just beginning. But now, he wasn't alone. The momentum of Marcus's movement continued to gather force. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of his actions spread far beyond his initial confrontation at the shopping center. The public's response to the policy changes at his company had been overwhelmingly positive, and it wasn't long before other CEOs began reaching out to him. They wanted to know how he had achieved such a rapid shift in public perception, and more importantly, they wanted to know how they could replicate his success in making real, lasting changes within their own organizations. Marcus wasn't one to shy away from the challenge. He had always known that the work he was doing wasn't just for his company, but for the entire industry. The conversation around diversity and inclusion was shifting, and he was at the forefront of that change. One evening, as Marcus prepared for yet another speaking engagement, Mia approached him with a new report. "Marcus, you're not going to believe this," she said with a mix of excitement and disbelief. The national news picked up on the story again. But this time, it's not just about your company, it's about the industry as a whole. They're calling it the Marcus Carter effect. Marcus paused, his gaze fixed on the screen in front of him as Mia read the headline aloud. "Business leaders follow Marcus Carter's lead, a new era for corporate diversity." His heart raced with pride. This wasn't just about one moment or one company anymore. It was about an entire movement, a shift in the way the business world viewed diversity, inclusion, and equity. Marcus knew that the true power of his actions wasn't just in the change he had made in his own company. It was in the influence he had over the industry at large. He had always believed that change could come from within, but now he realized just how much power he had to make that change happen on a larger scale. "What's next?" Mia asked, looking at Marcus with anticipation. Marcus smiled, a feeling of determination settling over him. "Next, we keep pushing," he said. "We push for more companies to adopt these policies. We make sure this isn't just a trend, but a movement that's here to stay." As Marcus prepared for his next speech, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. It had been a long road, full of challenges and obstacles, but it had also been one filled with triumphs and victories, each one pushing him further toward the ultimate goal: systemic change. The road ahead was still long, but Marcus was no longer walking it alone. He had become a symbol for a new kind of leadership, one rooted in authenticity, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. When Marcus took the stage at the next conference, he could feel the energy in the room shift. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the collective effort of everyone who had stood by his side, who had fought for the same cause. The movement was growing, and he knew that this was just the beginning. As he spoke to the crowd, Marcus's words resonated with them in a way that he hadn't anticipated. This isn't just about one man's fight. It's about all of us, standing together and demanding the respect we deserve. It's about making sure that no one ever has to face the kind of discrimination that I faced, that you faced, that we've all faced. It's time for change, and we're the ones who'll make it happen. The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus knew that, for the first time, the fight wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or judged based on their race, their identity, or their background. The world was finally starting to listen. And Marcus Carter, once just a man fighting for his own dignity, was now leading the charge for the dignity of all. The days that followed Marcus's speech marked a new chapter, not only for his company, but for the movement he had unknowingly set into motion. The business world was taking notice, and so were the people who had been quietly watching from the sidelines. His name had become synonymous with change, and soon, the discussions that started as small conversations in boardrooms were now echoing in corporate offices around the globe. But despite the recognition and praise, Marcus knew that the hardest part of this journey was still ahead. The systemic changes he wanted to see were not going to be easy to implement. They would take time, effort, and collaboration. He couldn't do it alone. As he sat at his desk one morning, scrolling through emails, a new message caught his eye. It was from a prominent CEO he had met at a conference months ago, someone who had been skeptical about diversity initiatives but had recently experienced a change in perspective. The email was short but impactful. "Marcus, I've been following your journey, and I think it's time we make some real changes in our company. Let's talk." Marcus felt a surge of excitement. This was the kind of shift he had been hoping for, real conversations happening in places where they hadn't before. He immediately responded, setting up a meeting for the following week. As he prepared for the meeting, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the long path that had brought him here. Growing up, he had never imagined himself in this position. He had faced countless challenges, but each one had taught him something valuable. He had learned to navigate spaces where he was often the only person of color, to speak up when no one else would, and to fight for a seat at the table. But now it was different. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been overlooked, underrepresented, or dismissed. He was fighting to create a future where people didn't have to prove they belonged in spaces that should have been open to them all along. The day of the meeting arrived, and Marcus walked into the conference room with a sense of purpose. The CEO who had reached out to him, John Matthews, was already seated, along with a few members of his executive team. "Marcus, it's good to finally meet you," John said, standing up to shake his hand. "I've heard a lot about you, and I'm ready to take action." Marcus nodded, appreciating the straightforwardness of the conversation. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied. "But taking action means more than just making a few changes. It means being committed to a long-term strategy, one that involves not only policy changes, but also a shift in company culture." John nodded in agreement. "I understand. And that's why we're here today. We want to make sure that our company is not only inclusive but actively supporting diversity at every level." The conversation that followed was nothing short of transformative. Marcus shared his experiences, his vision for the future, and the steps that he believed were necessary to create lasting change. John and his team listened intently, and by the end of the meeting, they had agreed on a plan of action that would reshape their company's approach to diversity and inclusion. As Marcus left the meeting, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was what he had been fighting for, real, tangible change that would impact not just one company but the entire industry. It was a step in the right direction, and Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more conversations, more partnerships, and more challenges along the way, but he was ready for them. He wasn't just changing one company. He was changing an entire industry, and with each step, he was making sure that the voices of those who had been silenced for so long were finally being heard. Months passed, and Marcus's influence continued to grow. The changes he had started in his company were now becoming a model for others to follow. Conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion were no longer just buzzwords. They were becoming central to the way businesses operated. More and more companies began reaching out to Marcus, seeking his advice on how they could make meaningful changes within their own organizations. He found himself in boardrooms, speaking to executives who had once been indifferent to the struggles of marginalized communities. But now, they were listening and they were ready to act. One afternoon, as Marcus was preparing for yet another speaking engagement, Mia walked into his office with a look of excitement on her face. "Marcus, you won't believe this," she said, holding up her phone. "The news just broke. You're being nominated for the Business Leadership Award." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He had been so focused on the work, on making real change, that he hadn't even considered recognition. But now, it was clear that his efforts were being noticed on a larger scale. The Business Leadership Award was one of the highest honors in the industry, and to be nominated was a sign that his impact was being acknowledged by those who mattered most. As Marcus processed the news, he felt a wave of gratitude. He had worked so hard to get to this point, but he had never done it for the recognition. He had done it because he believed in the change he was fighting for. And now, the world was beginning to see the fruits of that labor. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The nomination for the Business Leadership Award brought even more attention to Marcus and the movement he had helped create. Interviews, speeches, and meetings with influential leaders became part of his daily routine. But despite the accolades, Marcus remained focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't about him. It was about the people whose voices had been silenced for far too long. He knew that the real work was just beginning. During a conference he attended to discuss corporate responsibility, Marcus found himself on stage with some of the biggest names in business. As he looked out at the audience, he realized that the people who were sitting in those chairs were the ones who had the power to make the kind of change he was advocating for. And he knew that with each speech, each conversation, he was planting seeds that would one day grow into something far larger than he could imagine. As the conference wrapped up, Marcus received a message from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The message simply read, "I've been watching everything you've been doing. I'm proud of you." It was a small gesture, but for Marcus, it meant the world. He had come so far from the young man who had struggled to find his place in the world. Now he was a leader, not just in business but in the fight for equality.